Apologies if this sounds scratchy and grainy. I literally am using my headphones for this, so that's always a fun experience. Hope you enjoy the video. Simon Petrikov. One of the most interesting characters in Adventure Time, but also the most depressing character in the entire show. From a scientist to a princess-obsessed ice lunatic, he has had one of the biggest arcs in the entire show, and it is clearly showing. Simon's arc goes just way beyond it, with characters such as Betty being teased in the picture of his accomplishments in I Remember You. For the short of it, he is basically destined to be an unhappy person given that before insanity, he lost Betty to his future self, found Marcy, and he seemed to be happier, only for the Ice Crown to make him a less stable parental figure. His only course of action, the last scene choice he was probably able to make, was to leave Marcy with Hudson, though we don't really know how long that lasted till Hudson just dipped or Marcy sent him back to the Nilosphere. With all this context in mind, Simon has endured so much and he ends up being sad even without the world of wizarding hanging over him. In the episode Betty, Simon was fine with dying as long as he got to say goodbye to his fiancée first. Simon was completely content with dying because being Ice King was genuinely that awful, and he hadn't even considered Betty would try to jump through the Hambo portal at the time. Other stuff happens, which I will explain later, but as the timeline goes, Golb cures Simon as he is sane again, and then after Betty merged with Golb, that was sort of the end of Simon's arc. Or so it was. With the introduction of Fionna and Cake, this opened up a whole new arc for Simon, expanding upon what we already had, and making his development go further and beyond. Showing us through the dimensions we see the exact importance of Simon. Simon has to endure it all, unfortunately. The character recap I gave you was just the basic version. From the two dimensions we've seen that have held a Simon, or ones that we have actually interacted with in some way, it's clear that Simon had avoided enduring his problems. In The Winter King, he snapped, not wanting to deal with the madness of the crown and put it onto someone else. This, in turn, led to a lot more people suffering than regular Ice King had ever caused. As for Vampire World, I am not too honestly sure how Simon met his fate, but he could have stopped using the crown entirely after Betty disappeared from the first time he used it. Refusing to use the crown ended up in him dying early and then Marcy getting indoctrinated into the Vampire King's cult. With this reasoning, Simon has to go through everything for the world to be functional. He has to go insane, lose Betty, take in and abandon Marcy, experience near death, reunite, and lose Betty 2 times. He goes through so much, and after all that, he isn't allowed to be happy. After the initial Ice Crown incident, while he was sane, he most likely was able to be with Betty for a total of 15 minutes before Betty disappeared forever. Simon can be seen as someone who yearns for connection, seeing as how he wanted to be more with Betty, showing up the last minute right before she left. He wanted to be with her, and they did. But his happiness didn't last forever. After putting on the crown and Betty's subsequent disappearance, Simon was all alone until he found Marceline. Then, a connection between father and daughter was established. He cared for Marcy until the crown was taking over too much, and he had to leave her. He sacrificed his happiness to make sure Marcy was safe. Fast forward to Come Along With Me, Simon and Betty reunite, but Betty's sacrifice left Simon alone, even if he had Marceline and the others. In Distant Lands, he seemed to be doing fine, but then there was a quick scene with him dressed in the Ice King gown and saying it was how he copes. This being how he copes is only amplified in Fionna and Cake. In episode 2, we see Simon is living a boring day-to-day life trying to make something out of it. He tries to connect with other people through explaining what his life was like, or just trying to exist. Simon is denied of this tenfold. Astrid humiliates him, saying he was cooler as an insane lunatic, which even a dog found hilarious. When attempting to drink his sorrows away, Dirtbeard Guy says he liked Ice King's work, piled on by Finn, who laments that Jake liked it too. If people liking you better as a shattered insane man than who you are now just crushes Simon to his absolute limits. The subsequent scene shows Simon walking all alone while every other person and creature isn't. He is lacking the connection he wants. The final straw which caused Simon to open the portal to the Fionna and Cake world in his noggin was evil Chuskus, as well as the trash comic he had read right beforehand. Throughout the entire episode, his mind has been on Fionna and Cake, nothing else, which is why his focus was inevitably on them and not Betty. a contrast to episode 8, which I will get to. The arrival of Fionna and Cake now in reality, Simon has to face it that outside of Marcy and a few other people, he is more or less a tool for other people's enjoyment. Prismo used him as a glorified USB drive, which makes it worse when at the end of the OG series, Simon wished for Betty to come back to him, which Prismo couldn't do. This, with having to store what Prismo wants, makes Simon feel even worse. Added to that is Fionna and Cake. At first glance, both of them liked Ice King from what they saw, and they wanted the world to be magic again. They didn't even bother to ask if that's what Simon wanted. They only cared about having fun. With the episode of The Winter King, they meet a sane Ice King, but miss the red flags of his previous insanity. While Cake doesn't change her opinion, Fionna starts to change hers. She starts feeling like she's only causing suffering to everyone she meets. This gets amplified in episode 7, which climaxes in episode 8, where she sees firsthand what the crown actually did to Simon. This new revelation, alongside hurting innocent people, she backs away from it. Fionna, at this point, doesn't want Simon to suffer for her happiness, and so she hides the crown, hoping something else will happen. It's shown that while Fionna wants to have a fantasy, she isn't willing to go through it with it if other people have to go through so much more pain than her. This was the first real compassion Simon has received since Betty merged with Golb. Instead of seeing him as the Ice King or some glorified tool, Fionna saw him as Simon. But it was too late. Simon had already decided to become the Ice King again, because all the people had unintentionally said Ice King was better than him. He didn't care for a connection anymore because what was left? Simon as a character just goes through so much. From losing his fiancée, to leaving his surrogate daughter, to becoming insane, only to come back to sanity for his life to repeat nearly identical to the one he had hundreds of years ago, showing how he really hasn't got anything left. I don't know what'll happen in these last 2 episodes, but I can only assume there is one thing he can do to be happy and possibly restore magic to Fionna and Cake's world. He has to let Betty go.